in the raw, untamed stretch of the Oregon Territory in 1847, where pine trees scraped the sky and the wind whispered through the valleys like a lost hymn, lived a man named Tex. He was not a man of many words. His life was built on the rhythm of chopping wood, boiling coffee over an open fire, and sleeping beneath hand-stitched quilts that once smelled like a mother's love, a love long gone. While most men came west with wagons full of family dreams, Tex arrived alone. And 3 years later, he remained alone, tucked into a mountain cabin he had carved from wilderness, with calloused hands and silent prayers. Tex was 36, strong as an ox and weathered by time. He had a knack for felling trees with precision and could read the forest like a preacher reads scripture. The other loggers respected him even if they never quite understood him. Around the campfires, they joked about his hermit ways, called him Mountain Ghost, but none dared mock the sorrow in his eyes or the way he stared too long into the fire some nights as if waiting for something to appear from the flames. He wasn't bitter, just hollow. His loneliness wasn't loud, it was the kind that wrapped itself in quiet routines, the same cup of coffee each morning, the same single plate set at dinner, the same quilt folded on one side of a bed built wide enough for two. When the wind howled outside, Tex often spoke into it, his voice low, saying things he didn't even admit to himself. Not wishes, not exactly, just questions. Is anyone out there for me? Is there still time for love? Every Sunday, the loggers' camp cook invited him to town. Come on, Tex. Martha's baking apple pie. Bring your appetite in that empty chair of yours. Tex always declined with a smile. The truth, sitting at another man's family table, hurt more than eating alone. Their laughter, their stories of babies' first words. It was a language he'd never learned to speak. But one autumn morning, something pulled him off the mountain. He rode into Portland for flour nails and coffee, just another supply run. Yet the moment he stepped into the bustling market, he felt a strange tension in his chest. The place was alive, horses snorting, children darting between stalls, smoke curling from meat carts, and laughter bouncing off storefronts like it had somewhere to go. Then he heard shouting, harsh, jarring. Nova, stand straight. Don't embarrass me. A gaunt man with sunken eyes gripped a young woman's arm in front of a weather-worn wagon. She couldn't have been more than 17. Her dress was patched and faded, her wrists bruised. But there was a quiet strength in the way she stood, like a deer caught in the clearing, too proud to run. Tex froze. The man was speaking to a small crowd now, words spilling out fast and slick like oil. She's a hard worker, knows her way around a kitchen. Good bones, only 17. Who wants to start the bidding? Tex's stomach turned. He thought he'd seen the worst of mankind in the war, in the saloons in the mining towns where greed bled dry. But this selling your own daughter like livestock. Some men jeered. A few stepped closer, eyes full of hunger, not kindness. Tex saw Nova's chin tremble, but she never cried. That's what undid him. The way she stood there, humiliated and utterly alone, and still dignified, still unbroken. A voice cut through the tension. $45. A man named Hutchins, known for his cruelty to horses and worse toward women, licked his lips like he already owned her. Tex's heart pounded. He didn't think. He just spoke. $60. Every head turned. I'll pay $60. Tex repeated, stepping forward. But not to buy her. I'll marry her. If she says yes. Nova looked up, then truly looked at him. In her eyes he saw something achingly familiar, loneliness, fear, but also a flicker of something he hadn't seen in a long time, hope. The crowd shifted, murmuring. Nova nodded slowly. Yes, she said, her voice trembling but clear. "I'll marry you." And just like that, something in Tex shifted. A prayer long forgotten was answered not with a vision in fire or a booming voice from heaven, but with a bruised girl standing beside a wagon and choosing him. He took her hand. It felt small in his, but her grip was steady. That night, the wind carried a different tune through the pines outside his cabin. And for the first time in years, Tex felt like he wasn't just surviving the wilderness. He was coming home. When Tex brought Nova home to his weather-worn cabin deep in the Oregon pines, he didn't expect the silence to feel different. It was the same place he'd built with his own hands, walls sealed against the wind, a porch facing the sunrise, a single chair by the fire. But with Nova, there's something in the air shifted. She didn't speak much at first. She unpacked her few belongings, a frayed shawl, a worn leather satchel, and a small wooden cross that looked like it had been whittled by trembling hands. She moved through the cabin like a ghost, not yet convinced she was allowed to stay. But Tex didn't push. He gave her space-time in the bed, offering her safety. The only way he knew how, through quiet gestures and unspoken respect. Each morning, Tex rose before the sun as he always had. He'd chop wood out back or check the traps lining the ridge trail. He left a tin cup of coffee and a plate of beans near the fire each day, not knowing if she'd touch it. But slowly she did. First the coffee, then the beans, then one day she left a folded handkerchief where the plate had been clean, stitched with blue thread, and still warm from her pocket. That was how it began, an exchange without words. Just the slow build of trust in the spaces between chores and glances. By the end of the first week, Tex came home from the ridge to the smell of rising bread. His mother's old flour tin had been untouched for years now. It sat open on the table, speckled with white fingerprints. Nova was at the hearth, sleeves rolled to her elbows. Face flushed from the fire. She didn't flinch when he walked in, though she didn't speak either. Tex hung his coat and stood near the doorway, unsure if the sight of her working there made him feel more like a stranger in his own home, or the beginning of something else entirely. "You didn't have to," he said quietly, motioning to the dough. Nova, still kneading, shook her head. "I wanted to." It was the first sentence she spoke since they left town, and it landed with the weight of something sacred. They began sharing meals after that, 2 plates instead of 1. 2 chairs drawn close to the fire. Tex noticed how she always said a quiet prayer before eating. Head bowed low, hands folded in her lap like a child, unsure if someone was still listening. He started doing the same, not out of belief necessarily, but out of respect. Some nights she asked about the woods, the names of trees, or the habits of the elk that moved like shadows through the snow. Other nights they ate in silence. But the silence no longer scratched at Tex's ears. It had changed shape, become gentle, almost companionable. The sound of her breathing across the room was a comfort he hadn't known he'd needed. Tex tried not to watch her too closely, but he noticed things anyway. The way her hands knew how to mend shirts that had been long torn. How she opened windows just a crack, letting the scent of pine mix with the cabin smoke. How she sang to herself when she thought he was out of earshot, songs with no words. Just soft melodies that curled in the corners of the room like sunlight on cold wood. He didn't ask questions about her past. He could see enough in her eyes, the hollow tiredness of someone who'd run too far and the guarded stillness of someone waiting for the next betrayal. But she was trying. That was enough for Tex. He knew better than most that healing didn't come from talking. It came from staying. In his own way, Tex made room for her. He cleared out the second shelf of the cupboard, sharpened the kitchen knives, hung a second coat peg by the door. He started carving again, 2 small things at first. Like wooden buttons and spoons, then a little bird that sat on the windowsill watching the frost. One afternoon, Nova found it and traced its wings with her finger. "You made this?" she asked. Tex only nodded, ears going red. "It's beautiful," she said, then added, "No one's ever made anything for me before." That moment stuck in Tex's chest like a thorn. He didn't know how a woman so full of grace could have lived a life where kindness was a rarity, their routines entwined without effort. She began walking the trail behind the cabin, gathering pine resin and dried herbs for teas he didn't know the names of. He began leaving his boots by the door so she wouldn't have to mop muddy prints. She stacked firewood without being asked. He patched the hole in the roof over the bed without telling her. These were not grand gestures, but they stitched the days together like thread through torn cloth. With every shared glance, every meal eaten side by side, the cabin grew warmer, not in temperature but in spirit. There was still a distance between them, a silence rooted not in awkwardness but in things unspoken. Tex sometimes caught her staring at the mountains too long, jaw-clenched hands gripping her shawl like a lifeline. He knew pain lived there, pain he wasn't entitled to but wanted to understand. And Nova, she watched the way Tex moved, slow, deliberate, never raising his voice, never slamming doors. She noticed how he never touched her without asking, never called her anything but her name. She started leaving her hair down at night, started smiling when he brought her fresh apples from the valley. Tiny things, but they mattered. By the time the first snow dusted the roof of the cabin, Nova had laid a fresh cloth over the dinner table and Tex had carved her a second spoon. There was still a long road ahead and neither knew what the future held. But for the first time in years, Tex didn't dread the sound of footsteps outside his door. And Nova didn't flinch at every shadow anymore. The wilderness outside was still cold and wild, but inside that cabin something tender had begun to grow. Not love, not yet, but something stronger than loneliness, something almost like hope. Snow had settled deep into the folds of the Oregon hills by the time Nova's secret began to show. It wasn't sudden, more like a quiet shifting, the way the cabin's wood groaned in winter, or the hush before a storm. Tex noticed the change in her first, how she moved slower in the mornings, how she pressed her palm to her lower back when lifting the kettle, how her appetite changed, first craving dried peaches, then barely touching her plate. But he said nothing. He'd learned that silence in its own way could be a form of patience. Still, the question curled in his gut like smoke. Was she sick? Was something wrong? Nova, for her part, tried to keep the truth hidden. She wore thicker dresses, moved less, and folded her arms across her stomach when she caught Tex looking. Every day she carried the weight of her body and her past as if she could somehow will it away. But truth, like the mountain thaw, always finds its way through. And the moment came not with drama but with exhaustion. One night after supper, Nova sat by the fire longer than usual. Her sewing rested in her lap untouched. Her eyes were distant hands trembling. Finally, with a breath that seemed to come from the deepest place in her soul, she spoke. "I need to tell you something." Tex looked up from his chair where he'd been whittling a block of cedar into something he hadn't named yet. He set the carving down and turned to her, careful, quiet. "You can tell me anything." She nodded once but didn't meet his eyes. I'm not just tired. I'm pregnant." The last word landed like an iron nail between them. Tex didn't speak. Nova stared into the flames as if they might burn away what she feared. "It's not yours. I mean, of course it's not. It happened before you found me, before you offered me kindness." Her voice cracked. He wasn't kind. That sentence hung heavier than all the others. Tex stayed where he was, still as the pine trees in deep winter, not out of judgment but because he knew the weight of pain. that had no shape, no proper name. He let her speak. My father, he found out. That's why he sold me. Said no man would want me now. Said I brought shame to his name. He sold me like cattle. Her voice shrank to a whisper. I thought maybe if I didn't tell you I could start over. That maybe I didn't want to lose this. You, the cabin, the quiet. Tex didn't know what to say, not because he was angry, but because what he felt was not what she expected. He felt sorrow, yes, for what had been done to her. But more than that, he felt an aching tenderness, the kind that only comes when a heart cracks open for someone else's pain. He stood slowly and walked to the fireplace, kneeling beside her. You haven't lost anything, he said, his voice low. Not me, not this place, not your right to be safe. He reached out not to touch her, but to offer her the choice. She looked down, saw his hand, and took it. Her fingers were cold, but the grip was steady. I don't know how to raise a child, she admitted. I don't either, he said, but I reckon we'll learn together. She wept then, not loud, not dramatic, just quiet tears sliding down her cheeks like snowmelt thawing something she'd kept frozen for too long. Tex didn't tell her not to cry. He simply stayed beside her, hand in hers, until the fire burned low and the silence returned, no longer sharp but soft, almost healing. In the days that followed, things changed not in grand ways, but in quiet, permanent ones. Tex began building a cradle. It was nothing fancy, just pine wood, sanded, smooth curved edges, and a little engraving at the top, a single sprig of wild sage carved with a steady hand. Nova watched him work from the kitchen window, sometimes with a hand on her stomach, sometimes with a faint smile that hadn't lived on her face for months. She began preparing for the baby, not out of fear, but in small ways that spoke of hope. She mended tiny blankets from old shirts, organized the dried herbs for labor pains, even hummed when she swept the floor. The child had gone from a hidden shame to a quiet promise, not just of new life, but of redemption. Not just hers, but his too. Because Tex, though steady and strong, had ghosts of his own. He had buried a younger brother back in Missouri, a boy who drowned while Tex was meant to be watching. He had spent years carrying guilt that no one could see, but now, as he traced the lines of the cradle, he thought not of failure but of chance. Maybe this time I get it right. One night, Nova asked him, "Do you really want this child, even if it's not yours?" Tex didn't hesitate. It may not be mine by blood, but if she's yours, she's already family to me. That night, Nova placed his hand on her belly for the first time. He felt a flutter beneath her skin, small, uncertain, like the heartbeat of a second chance. And in that moment, under the creak of the pine beams and the soft rustle of firewood, a man and a woman who had every reason to give up found something new. The first quiet, trembling stirrings of a family chosen, not born. Forged not by blood, but by love freely given. Word spreads fast in small towns, especially when the story is heavy enough to sink a reputation. By the time the third snowfall blanketed the logging road into Portland, folks had started whispering about Tex. They said the quiet mountain man had married a girl too young, too strange, and too troubled. Some said she was already carrying another man's child. Others claimed she bewitched him with silence and soft eyes. They didn't say these things to his face, not yet, but he could feel it all the same. In the way storekeepers didn't meet his eyes, in how the blacksmith gave short answers instead of warm ones, in how children stopped playing when Nova walked past clutching her belly. Nova felt it too. She began pulling her shawl tighter, walking behind Tex when they went to town. Where once she might have paused at the bakery window or smiled at a passing dog, she now kept her eyes to the ground. The town didn't throw stones, but it didn't need to. Their silence and stares were loud enough. And when the gossip reached the ears of the other loggers in Tex's camp, the trouble truly began. Tex had never cared for popularity, and the men respected him enough to stay out of his business. But now some of them started talking in the mess tent around the fire out on the trails. One man, Burke, spat tobacco into the snow and said loud enough for all to hear, "A real man wouldn't raise another man's bastard." No one laughed, but no one stopped him either. Tex didn't respond that day, just stared at the fire a little longer, jaw-tight eyes, distant. But Nova heard. One of the cook's sons repeated it to her in a cruel, sing-song voice, and something inside her cracked. That night, back at the cabin, she told Tex she would leave. "It's not fair to you," she said, voice steady but distant. "They'll always look at you and see a fool." Tex didn't raise his voice. He never did. He simply walked across the room, knelt before her, and took both her hands. "Let them look," he said. "Let them talk. I know what I have, and I'd rather be called a fool beside you than praised alone." Nova blinked, unsure whether to cry or believe him. But when he kissed her knuckles gently, reverently, she knew this wasn't pity. This was choice. Still, the pressure grew. Burke and a few others came to Tex one afternoon at the mill under the pretense of checking equipment. "It's not personal," Burke said, "but of course it was. We just think it'd be best for everyone if you sent her to the convent or something. There's places for girls like that." Tex set his saw down slowly. "Girls like what he asked. You know," Burke said, shrugging. "Ruined." The word hit the air like gunpowder. Tex stepped closer. "You say that again, and I'll forget I'm a man of peace." No fists were thrown. But Burke never spoke to Tex again. The real test came 2 weeks later when a rider approached the cabin in a cloud of snow and arrogance. Nova's father, McKenna. His face hadn't changed. Same cold eyes, same brittle mouth twisted in disdain. He didn't dismount, just stared down at Tex from the saddle and sneered. "Didn't think she'd take," he said. "Wasn't sure you'd be fool enough to keep her." Nova appeared in the doorway, hand resting instinctively on her round stomach. McKenna's eyes flicked toward her with something between disgust and calculation. "I want money," he said. "Not for her, for my silence. Folks'd be real interested to hear what she's carrying." Tex didn't even blink. "They already know," he said. "They just don't know what kind of man stays." McKenna chuckled, a sound like a rusty nail. "You think you're noble, you're just another idiot thinking love can make a whore into a wife." Tex stepped off the porch. Calm, cold, deadly serious. "You sold your daughter, McKenna. That's all anyone needs to know. You come near her again, you'll leave with less than you came with." There was a long moment of stillness, just wind and hoofbeat and breath, before McKenna spit into the snow and turned his horse. He never returned. Inside, Nova sat by the hearth, shaking. "Why didn't you let me speak?" she whispered. Tex knelt beside her, took her hand in his. "Because no one who loves you should have to defend their right to exist." She wept then, but not from fear, from relief. After that day, something shifted. The town still whispered, but they did it quieter now. Burke and his men stayed away. The midwife, Mrs. Langdon, began stopping by with jars of broth and tips for childbirth. A neighbor left extra firewood on the trail. No apologies were spoken, but the walls softened. People began to see not a scandal, but a family, one built not by perfection, but by loyalty in the face of scorn. Tex and Nova didn't talk much about that winter, but they remembered it in the way she leaned into his chest when the wind howled, in the way he kept his hand on hers as her belly grew. Not every battle is won with guns or fists. Some are won simply by staying. And stay he did. The winter deepened like a wound that wouldn't close. Snow layered itself over the hills like a quiet threat, cutting off the outside world inch by inch. The trail to town became treacherous, the rivers froze over, and even the wind changed sharper, more personal, as if it knew who could withstand it and who couldn't. Inside the cabin, Tex and Nova did their best to prepare. The fire was kept burning night and day, meals rationed with quiet discipline, and every sound outside, every creak of ice, every moan of tree limbs was met with a shared glance. Nova's belly had grown heavy and full, and each movement took more of her breath, each step carried more risk. They both knew the child would arrive soon. The only question was whether the world outside would let them survive it. Tex had built the cradle weeks ago, but now he reinforced it, checking each joint, sanding the rails smooth over and over as if he could send away his fear. He had never delivered a child before. He hadn't even held one since his younger brother passed on the banks of the Missouri River so many years ago. But he remembered things: his mother's voice when she calmed a crying baby, the basin of boiled water she always kept warm, the linen she folded with shaking hands but firm resolve. He used that memory now as a guide. There was no doctor in reach, and even if there had been, no one would have made it through the snowdrifts without risking their lives. If this baby came in the night, it would be Tex who caught her. It would be Nova who endured alone. And it would be God or sheer grit that got them through. Nova never complained. Even as her back ached, even as sleep slipped away night after night, she never raised her voice, never cried out in self-pity. Only once did she whisper into the fire, "I hope she never knows how afraid I was." Tex heard her but said nothing then. He simply wrapped her hand in his, lacing his fingers around hers as if trying to hold together something fragile and holy. "She'll know, love," he said eventually. "That's more than most start with." The pain began on a Tuesday, the kind of day where the sky pressed low and gray and the wind carried the smell of frozen pine and distant storms. Nova stood by the window when it happened. A sharp breath, a tightening around her stomach, a quiet curse barely audible over the crackle of the fire. At first she said nothing, just gritted her teeth and gripped the windowsill. But when her knees buckled and she cried out, Tex was already beside her. He didn't panic, not outwardly. He helped her to the bed, lit every lantern in the room, and fetched water from the kettle. He remembered his mother saying birth was like a river you couldn't force. It couldn't stop it, only guide the boat and pray the rocks didn't break it open. He laid towels, wiped sweat from Nova's brow, whispered words he didn't know he remembered. "You're strong. You're not alone. I've got you. I've got you." The hours crawled. Night fell. Nova's cries became sharper, ragged. Her hands clawed the wool blankets, her face drenched in sweat and grit. At one point she screamed not out of weakness but from the sheer force of life moving through her. Tex had never heard a sound like it. It made something deep in his chest shake loose. He held her through each contraction, steady as bedrock, even when her nails dug into his forearm. Even when she sobbed that she couldn't do it. "You already are," he told her. "You're doing it, darling. You're bringing her home." And then a stillness, a long breath held by the world itself. Nova gave one final push and collapsed back into the pillows, exhausted, trembling, eyes wide with fear. Tex caught the baby. She was slick, small, and silent. For one horrifying moment there was nothing, no cry, no movement, only the sound of Tex's heart beating like war drums. Then a gasp, a sharp breath, and a wail that split the night like dawn breaking over a frozen plain. The child's cry filled the cabin, filled Tex's lungs, filled the hollow space between past and future. "It's a girl," he whispered, barely able to speak. Nova, eyes half-lidded and barely conscious, gave a weak smile. "Grace," she said. "Her name is Grace." Tex wrapped the child in a wool shawl, his hands trembling as he placed her against Nova's chest. She nestled there instinctively, skin to skin, heart to heart, and in that moment nothing else existed. Not the cold, not the judgment, not the past, only this, a man kneeling beside the woman he loved, both broken in ways the world would never understand. And the child between them, proof that something holy could rise from ruin. That night the storm howled outside. Snow beat against the windows like fists. But inside the cabin glowed, not from firelight but from something quieter, something older. Tex sat in the rocking chair with Grace bundled in his arms, Nova asleep beside him. The cradle sat empty just for tonight, as if even it knew that some moments are meant to be held close, not set aside. He looked down at the child and felt something he hadn't felt in decades, not just hope, but peace. A quiet knowing that whatever came next, they'd face it together. He had not planned for this life, had not gone searching for a girl in a marketplace or a baby in the dead of winter. But they had found him, and that made all the difference. Outside, the wind carried snow through the trees. Inside, a man rocked his daughter for the first time. And somewhere in the flickering firelight, the past finally began to let go. By the time spring touched the edge of the Oregon pines, melting the snow in quiet rivers and warming the soul beneath the frost, the world around Tex's cabin had changed, but not nearly as much as the world within it. The long winter, with all its trials and shadows, had become a season not of loss but of arrival. Grace thrived in her mother's arms, her cries strong, her eyes wide and curious. Nova walked slower now, with a softness in her step that hadn't been there before, not just because her body was healing, but because her spirit was too. Inside those worn pine walls, life had settled into new rhythms. Morning feedings replaced coffee silence. Tex learned how to hold a baby with one hand and stir stew with the other. He began carving tiny animals for Grace, each one tucked beside her in the cradle. Nova sang again, not the wordless hymns of fear she once whispered, but lullabies that wove her past and future into something tender. She stitched dresses from scraps, told stories by the fire, and sometimes just stood at the window holding her daughter, watching the sun come up through the tree. She wasn't just surviving anymore, and Tex, the man who once lived in silence, who once believed his life was already written, had become something new, a husband in truth, a father by choice, a protector not only of home and hearth, but of fragile things, trust, gentleness, second chances. He had not saved Nova, she had not saved him. What they had done together was choose to stay, choose to try again and again, even when it was hard, even when it hurt. People in town still whispered, of course, but not as much. Some began waving when Tex rode in for supplies. Mrs. Langdon left a bonnet on their doorstep. Burke never spoke another word, but he never challenged Tex again. And once near the end of March, a young mother in the general store nodded at Nova and said simply, "She's beautiful." That was all. But it was enough. They named their little girl Grace, not just because of the mercy she symbolized, but because she was living proof that love does not need to be born from blood to be real. She was the answer to a prayer Tex never spoke aloud, the reason Nova could breathe deeply again, the tie that bound three wandering souls into a family forged by fire, not fate. And in that old cabin nestled beneath the pines where sorrow once slept beside silence, there now lived something far more enduring. Not happiness, perhaps, in the way storybooks promise, but something better, peace earned through pain. Love born from choice and the kind of quiet joy that doesn't shout but stays. The storm had passed. The fire still burned. And for the first time in a long time, no one was waiting for the other to disappear. They were home, together. This story of Tex, Nova, and baby Grace carries a profound message that love, healing, and belonging are not always born from ideal beginnings, but often rise from brokenness bravely faced. It reminds us that people are not defined by their past, nor by what others think they deserve, but by the choices they make when life hands them pain. Tex's quiet strength shows that even a man hardened by solitude can open his heart again. And Nova's journey proves that even someone discarded by family can build a new one rooted in dignity and trust. Their shared life teaches us that redemption is not a grand gesture, but a daily commitment, a kind word, a place at the table, a refusal to abandon someone when it's hard. In a world quick to judge and slow to forgive, this story urges us to be gentler with ourselves, with others, and to believe that something beautiful can still grow from a wounded place. Most importantly, it tells us that family isn't only who we're born to, but who chooses to stay to love and to build a life with us when we need it most. That kind of love is the real miracle. If this story moved you, if you found a piece of yourself in Tex's quiet courage and Nova's resilience, or in the tiny miracle they named grace, we invite you to be part of something bigger. Subscribe to our channel to support heartfelt storytelling that uplifts, heals, and reminds us all of the strength it takes to love again. Your support helps us bring more powerful emotional narratives like this one to life, stories rooted in hope, redemption, and the human spirit. Like, comment, and share if this touched you. And remember, sometimes the most ordinary people carry the most extraordinary stories. Be part of the journey. Be part of the family. Subscribe now.